live on unceded Stalo First Nations territory. That means that the land where I live was taken through colonial violence from the Indigenous communities that lived here since time immemorial. I used to be a fourth grade teacher. I am now working full-time as a YA author. I released my first book, a poetry collection called When You Ask Me Where I'm Going, about a year and a half ago. And my brand new book, If I Tell You the Truth, is a novel that just came out in January, and it deals with the experiences of a Punjabi mother and daughter navigating the immigration system in Canada and carrying a very painful secret that has huge political ramifications. So I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm so excited to chat with the other panelists about all of the amazing work that they're doing.
Hi, everyone. I'm Bilal Zahoor. I'm the editorial director of Folio Books, which is a Lahore-based independent publishing house. I'm also the editor of the widely reviewed volume called Rethinking Pakistan, a 21st Century Perspective. Besides Folio, I work at Haqooq-e-Khalq movement, which is a grassroots movement based in Punjab, but aspires to sort of spread to all parts of Pakistan. I look forward to this exciting conversation. We'll share some of my experiences around independent publishing and look forward to interacting with the worthy panelists as well as the audiences and people who have participated in the Zoom session. Yeah.
Thank you so much, panelists, for your introductions. To start off, I'm going to ask each of our panelists a question or two, and then we're going to open up the discussion with a few general questions, but we would love to have some questions from participants as well. So if you would like to ask a question, please feel free to DM Saqib, and we will ask you to unmute or ask your question. And you can also ask one of us to share the question if you're not comfortable unmuting. So to start off, I'm going to ask Sita a question. In your writing, you focused on South Asian representation for children. Why did you choose children's books as a method of creating representation? What elements do you incorporate in your writing to create this representation?
I think children are like sponges. You know, their minds, the young minds. They like to absorb everything they see, everything they hear. So keeping that in mind, I think it only makes sense to start incorporating lessons about love and acceptance and inclusion when they're most likely to take it in, you know. I think as parents, educators, and as writers, I think we have this amazing ability to shape these young minds and instill in them some important and lifelong, lessons and values. And also, for example, like, how do you explain what is unjust to a 4-year-old? You know, I think picture books make it easier to unpack real life situations. I think picture books make it really easy to talk about hard situations, you know. And in these times, you know, I think where there is so much unjust and so much chaos around us, it becomes important, I think, more than ever, to help our children better understand themselves, not only themselves, but the world around them, you know. So now I think a good book is a great way to start conversations about a difficult topic, especially a picture book, and especially with children, you know. So I think that's why the medium of children's book for me. And how do I incorporate this into my writing? So I think my writing is inspired from my own personal experiences of living in the East and the West, you know. I guess that really helps me create characters and situations, I think that are more relatable to immigrants like myself, or to children of immigrants, like my own 3 children, like Indian American children. So, there is a term that we use in the literary world, which is called mirrors and windows, So my hope is to incorporate elements that make my book either a mirror, where children see characters who look like them, so that they feel a sense of belonging. Or I want to make my book a window where children see characters who don't look like them, so that they can value other identities, and they can learn to celebrate differences. So that's what I hope to achieve, and that's how I hope to achieve representation in my writing.
Thank you so much for that answer. I know that I would have loved reading children's books that were mirrors to me when I was younger, so I really appreciate the work you do.
Thank you.
This next question is for Bilal. You established Folio Books, an independent publishing platform in Pakistan. What was the hardest part of establishing this publishing platform, and why is strengthening the publishing industry important for centering voices of marginalized communities?
Right. Thank you, Nandini. Thank you also to Sita for sharing her experiences of, bringing out some of the great books and literature for children. Something I think that's much more needed. I mean, more needed than ever in the context of, the sort of the onslaught on freedom of expression, and the shrinking spaces all over the world, not just in South Asia. It's 12:15 a.m. here in Pakistan, so I hope I don't doze off in the middle. But to answer your question, Nandini, I think before I directly, answer the challenges facing folio books or independent publishing in general in Pakistan, I would like to sort of briefly comment on the state structure that countries like Pakistan inherited from the European colonizers. I think there is a huge bit of similarity between how the British colonizers used to operate and function and work in colonial India, and how states like Pakistan continue to sort of perform some of the same functions. For instance, the state of Pakistan still looks at the Pashtuns as the martial warrior race, a stereotype hugely popularized by the British colonizers. Pakistan still has many of the same laws that sort of have their origin in the colonial period in India. Interestingly, Pakistan military still recruits the bulk of the soldiers from the same districts and regions the British used to. So in many ways, the post-colonial state of Pakistan is a colonial state, and it still looks at dissent, at critique, at sort of critical voices, astonishingly and appallingly the same way the British used to look at dissent and all those dissenting voices. And it is in this context that the challenges of the publishing industry, particularly of the independent publishers, come to fore. So on the one hand, there is a huge onslaught on freedom of expression, and resultantly, on the other hand, there is this self-censorship that we publishers have to sort of adopt and stick to resultantly. For instance, there's this interesting and rather ridiculous incident of the Punjab government banning over 100 books last year, textbooks. So these are the textbooks, for the school children who tended to sort of deviate slightly, just slightly from the state-sanctioned, state-approved jingoism. And what they had to face was the banning of their books, and there are over 100 of them. The same year, the Punjab government, and Punjab happens to be the most populous province of Pakistan, also the most powerful in the context of interprovincial situation. The Punjab government tried to pass another bill. It actually passed the bill, but somehow didn't sort of reach the second stage. It's called the Tahaffuze Bunyade Islam Bill, a bill that envisions to see every manuscript scrutinized and looked at by a bureaucratic authority. The same colonial structure that sort of used to haunt India for decades still continues to haunt India. I mean, and Pakistan in that context. So the bill sort of wanted each of the books and manuscripts to be submitted to a particular authority, and that bureaucratic authority will then sort of take the decision and see if a particular book can see the light of the day or not. I mean, as ridiculous as that. So it is the context of repressing those critical publishing voices that Folio seems to find itself in a very tricky and difficult situation. And I think these are some of the challenges that face all the left-leaning progressive publishers in Pakistan. I mean, there are other challenges, of course, the issues of readership, the decreasing number of bookstores in Pakistan, and the complete absence of any structure that helps or sort of incentivizes publishers doing good in, say, some of the international foreign markets, or publishers who are doing good locally. But I think more important are the challenges that I discussed earlier. So yeah, I think that's the most on the front of challenges facing critical voices in Pakistan. I'll share some of the more experiences in the next question.
Thank you so much for your insight and all the valuable publishing work you do. I also want to thank you again for calling here in so late and being here with us. My next question is for Jasmin. How do you use your writing to explore the intersectionality between gender, citizenship, and social justice?
That is a fantastic question. And I just wanted to know before I even begin that, like, as Bilal and Zaid were speaking, I just wanted to like snap, because I hear everything you guys are saying, especially about speaking to youth about, social justice issues, and also like censorship. I just learned so much about what's happening with censorship in Pakistan and in West Punjab. My experience has been in East Punjab, in Punjab that is occupied by India, and the censorship issues are very similar. That colonial structure is very similar. So I was like hearing so much of what I've known for my whole life mirrored within another state, and that is the nature of like these kind of oppressive states, isn't it? Growing up as a Sikh in Canada, as a young Sikh child, conversations about social justice were just a part of how we grew up, in very radical ways. I remember learning as a very young child about what happened in Punjab in the 80s, the genocide of 1984, and the ramifications that the genocide has had years later, spanning all the way now, into 2021, where we're witnessing the uprising of marginalized farmers in Punjab and across India, who are have come to a boiling point after decades of being, subjugated and having their economic needs thrown to the side. We see all of these things happening in connection with one another. So these conversations have been a part of my life since I was a little kid, and I think that's where my love for social justice has come from. So when it comes to this question of like, how do I bring together, gender-based issues and identity-based issues and immigration issues, it's funny because like I conscientiously do not think, okay, now I need to write a poem about this, this, and this, but it all just kind of happens because that is our life. That is what we've that is what I experience on a daily basis, and it's natural for what we experience to come and become manifest in the work that we do. And for us to need an outlet in the face of this world that is constantly trying to just like erase our voices and shrink us and push us to the side, for me, art is that outlet where I can just scream and be loud and say everything that needs to be said. And the other thing is, I think growing up in Canada, experiencing, well, one, knowing, you know, everything about what has been happening in my motherland of Punjab, but also experiencing racism, experiencing microaggressions and macroaggressions in a white supremacist society, it definitely tilts you towards activism without even you realizing that that's where your life is going. You can't experience oppression without wanting to stand back up. And I think it's just an innate intuitive thing within us as human beings. And the other interesting thing is I'm 28 years old now, and I'm now an author of a novel and working on another novel, and I wrote a poetry book, but my journey did not begin with writing. It didn't begin with this idea that I was going to go out and be a novelist. My journey, I think, as a writer and as a poet began as a 19-year-old just falling in love with social justice. I remember, you know, encountering poetry on YouTube for the first time when I was about 19 years old, and exchanging poetry videos with my friends. And through the inspiration that I received from these political poetry videos, these spoken word videos, wanting to organize a poetry event for my community related to political prisoners in Punjab. And just having this love for art as a way of expressing and freeing ourselves from these shackles was what ultimately led me into using my poetry to speak to the issues that matter to me. So it's just funny that like my journey as a novelist began with me falling in love with activism and resistance and political movements, and has ultimately carried me all the way here now, where I've written a novel about, you know, a Punjabi mother who is challenging a powerful public figure in Punjab. And I don't want to give away the whole novel, but who's challenging a powerful public figure in Punjab and who is making decisions for her and her daughter that will have huge political ramifications for herself and for Punjab politics and so many things. And I often get asked like what inspired these kinds of conversations, and it was just being that kid who was like seeing all this injustice happening and wanting to do something about it or wanting to say something about it, but not always knowing how. And storytelling has become one of my most important mediums to be able to shout into this world that so often tells us to just be quiet.
Thank you so much for explaining how you explore that intersectionality and sharing that piece of your journey with us. So now we have a question from our audience. Do you deal with anxiety when writing? If so, how do you negotiate with that? So that's open to all of you.
I can speak to that. So I definitely get anxious when writing poetry. I've written on topics that are really, really important to myself. And when you write about anything that is important to you, it's just human nature that not everyone is going to agree with you, and that's okay. But it can be very hard to write on a powerful and heavy topic, knowing that the world will not always be kind about it. So for example, I wrote a poem a few years ago related to a law that was passed in the US around abortion rights. And it was this poem just written from a place of like rage that women's and the rights of people with uteruses and with wombs are being taken away. And that this world is essentially saying that people do not have the right to control their own lives, their own futures, their own bodies. And I just posted this poem onto Instagram out of pure anger for these political things that were happening in the US, and the response was awesome. But of course, there was also going to be a whole lot of folks who read that and were upset about it for all sorts of different reasons. And my comment section became just a mess of people trying to debate with each other. So one thing that I've learned as a writer is that if your work doesn't make somebody upset, then you're doing it wrong. Because you need to be able to stand for a conviction loud enough that there's going to be someone who wants to burn your book because of it. And that's how you know that you're doing this work right. It can be scary, but the beauty of it is that the people who need that work, the people who that work are who you've written that work for, they are going to take solace and comfort and find power in it. And that makes it worthwhile when you're thinking about the trolls who are going to be upset about the work. In my novel, My character, she's a teenage girl who's also an artist, and she wants to speak to the world about a social justice issue or an issue that is close to her heart and her mother's heart, but she knows that the world is not going to take kindly to it. So she takes solace in poetry and visual art to give herself the strength that she needs to be able to speak to these issues. And that drew directly from my own experience, where when things get hard, I turn to visual art and I turn to poetry and I turn to writing to be able to find my strength again. And it kind of became like meta in the book, where we see the power of expression in finding your voice. So that's what I do. I paint and I draw and I color and I write when I'm anxious. And we continue the cycle again and again.
That's incredible. Thank you for sharing that. So I have a question for Bilal. I would love to hear more about your experience at Folio Books. Could you talk a little bit more about why writing and publishing stories is important to the disruption of dominant post-colonial and neoliberal narratives?
Right. Thank you. I think Folio Books has a focus on. Unfortunately, it's we haven't published many novels because our focus is majorly academic books, but we have started to sort of publish more and more novels and poetry at the same time. It's a publishing house that has a focus on politics, history, and gender. Um, Before I sort of share some of the experiences coming from running this publishing house, I think it's important to sort of understand the publishing landscape around the world, but particularly in South Asia, and the independent component of the publishing house and how it sort of works. We can see increasingly there are publishers, left-wing publishers around the world who are very much connected to the politics around. Many of them are connected to the grassroots movement in their particular regions. And I think this is strikingly different from the big five and from all the other publishers who are basically driven by profits. Independent publishers are basically not really driven by profits, or they don't sort of see seem to amass wealth or have huge profits. What they really look at is, I mean, book sales are not the end to them. It's a means to sort of communicate their politics. So I think it is this very component of the publishing industry anywhere in the world that needs to flourish, that needs greater attention, that needs support from friends and comrades all around the world. Lately, we have seen Verso Books, Jacobin, Haymarket, and Seven Stories Press joining hands to sort of form an orbit in the US and the UK. There's a great publishing house in India, Leftward Books, based in Delhi, who is very much connected to the left-wing progressive politics in India. In Pakistan, Folio Books is trying to do some similar work. We are very strongly connected to the students' movement, with the women movement, the feminist struggle, and of course also the Hakuk-e-Khalq movement based in Lahore. As far as the question of the importance of centering the voices from the margins is concerned, this is again, I think, the job of independent publishers. So whether it is centering the voices from the margins, whether it is taking strong anti-capitalist positions, whether it is about taking strong anti-austerity position, it is about opposing wars, it is about opposing Islamophobia, it is about supporting radical feminist movements all around the world. This has historically been the hallmark of independent publishers. Precisely because they have, I mean, they do two sort of things, and very clearly, they are very clear about it. So one is their direct, unapologetic support and active participation in the left-wing struggle and politics. And secondly, they, I think ahead of time. They are always central and instrumental in pushing social and intellectual boundaries. They are basically, I would say, the theoretical, philosophical, and intellectual Oriel of any society. They are basically the conscience of the larger publishing industry, the independent component of the publishing industry, is what I'm saying, is the conscience of the larger publishing industry anywhere in the world. So I think it's important we support more and more independent publishers, and by that, we also indirectly support all those voices otherwise marginalized, the religious, the voices, I mean, marginalized in context of religion, in context of race, in context of politics, and of course in the context of economic marginalization as well. So that, I think, um, is one of the central tenets of publishing here at Folio Books as well. And we look forward to being connected to more and more South Asian writers who sort of, come from a critical, progressive perspective. And doesn't matter, I mean, irrespective of the genre, they, if they try to sort of push certain boundaries, we would be sort of, happy to take forward the narratives. This is also, I think, because the power of the printed word is sort of apparent to all of us, is known to all of us. This is probably also the reason that we see so many books banned. I mean, time and again. An example to that is the recent banning of the Urdu translation of Pakistani novelist Muhammad Hanif. His book, The Case of Exploding Mangoes, when translated in Urdu, was banned by the state the last year. And that kind of reflects the power of the printed word. And I think all those stories that continue to buck and resist neoliberal trends and authoritarian tendencies.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Folio Books and what it stands for is truly incredible. This, going off your point that there's so much power in printed word, one of the audience members asked, how do you measure the impact of your writing, or Bilal, in your case, publishing, once you release it to the world?
I think one way to measure it is it banned or not. I mean, jokes apart, I think, I remember there was, the important, the hugely popular early 20th century novel, Upton Sinclair's Jungle, was super impactful precisely because it paved the way for the passing of the laws that eventually inspected the meat packing industry in the US. So that's one way to sort of gauge the impact, but there can be other ways as well. We remember Saadat Hasan Manto from India, who was, under incredible pressure and who faced, who was jailed as well, and who had equally terrible time both in the colonial and post-colonial India. Uh, uh, so yeah, we can. Those are some of the examples that basically reflect the power of the printed word and the kind of impact that a particular piece of work can eventually yield. But I think the 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 answer to the very particular question about the impact of your writing in the modern world, I think, is simply about how many reviews the book has seen, how much critique the book has faced, and how much contribution it has made to the propagation of a particular kind of a discourse. How much it has been in news is also an aspect to look at. But I think the importance is the kind of debates that a particular work has triggered. So that, to me, is central to the impact of a work.
Jasmine or Sita, could you give us your insight on how you measure the impact of your writing?
Yeah, just to add on to that, I think that in a capitalist world, we are very often taught to view everything in terms of money, in terms of like how monetarily successful everything is. And I think that this is in itself like a form of violence against our psyches, especially as artists and creatives and storytellers. So the way I personally measure success with my book is the personal impact that it's had on every individual reader. I remember receiving a message from a reader once about a poem I wrote about spousal abuse and domestic violence, and she messaged me and she sent me a message on Instagram when I posted that poem and said that this poem gave me the motivation I needed to book a plane ticket and leave this man and get a divorce. And I was like, I think with that, like my career's has everything I wanted to do in my career has been met. I whatever happens from now on, it's all good. But the fact that this one person's life has been impacted in this meaningful way, I think that I can sleep well at night knowing that I set out to do what I meant to do. Um, so I'm an author who just actively avoids thinking about like the sales and the numbers and all those kinds of things because my creative process becomes inhibited by that. And I leave that to the people on the business side. And I just work as hard as I possibly can to have those kinds of connections with readers that that are touching their hearts in a powerful and life-altering way.
It's really beautiful. Thank you for that answer.
Yeah, to bounce off what Jasmine said, I think even if your writing is making difference in like, for me in terms of kids, even if it's impacting like one child, you know, to me, I'm successful. My writing is successful. I wrote, this is my picture book, which is about self-acceptance. And it is a story about a white peacock who learns to love himself. It is about a journey to self-discovery. And with this book, it just came out last month, but I have received, as Jasmine said, I have received so many messages from children's parents and separately in my DM that, you know, my child read this book and they could see themselves because it's about how you can overcome your differences and what your journey is like. And so if even if a few children are seeing themselves in the stories that you are telling, I think your job as a writer is done. Similarly, I mean, I have not looked at reviews. It's very hard to ignore the reviews, but I try consciously not to look at them because there's always going to be some reviews. Some people, as you said, storytelling is a very personal. We're bringing our own personal experiences, so it's very hard to please everyone. But I think it's more important to just write what you believe in and keep writing and not worry about what others are saying, as long as a few children are impacted by your stories.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That's really beautiful as well. So my next question is, do you have any advice for aspiring writers? And what would you say to the youth that is trying to get into storytelling and artistic expression?
Yeah, so I'd say, I'd say, just as I said, you write the stories that you believe in. I'd say write from what comes from your heart. I think we all have stories to tell. I think we all have stories that only we can tell, you know, because based on our own experiences. So I think that's why it becomes very important to write what you believe in or to write what comes from your heart. And because getting published, I think it's really, really hard getting published. It's a very hard journey and it takes a lot of, patience and persistence. And, there are so many rejections at every stage and, in this whole journey. So I think believing in your stories, I think that just keeps you on staying on this path and not give up your hopes. So I think for aspiring writers, it's the only thing I'd say is just believe in your stories and stay at it, like not give up,
Yeah, and to add to that, I would say patience is so important, and that's something I've learned having been in this industry for a long time, or for a few years now, not a long time. But I think that when we're living in a day and age where everything is happening so fast, you know, you go onto social media and Instagram expects you to post something every single day in order to maintain your engagement. And we're living in a world where everything is monetized on the internet all the time. We're kind of subconsciously taught that we better hurry up and get our work, you know, get our book published and meet all these like worldly goals. And in the process, our creative practice is kind of is negatively impacted. So one thing that I've learned is like patience and taking your time with that project that you're working on is not going to inhibit the fact that it gets published. You know, if you spend that time that it deserves working on the draft, working on your manuscript draft, and getting it in as strong shape as possible, when it's time to go and hand it to an editor or hand it to an agent, it's going to be it's going to be in an even better position to be published, and it's going to have the impact on the world that it needs to have. So take your time. Don't feel like just because someone else is there that you need to like run and meet that place as well. Give your work the patience that the internet may not always teach you to have for yourself. And one example in my own life is like I'm doing my master's degree right now, having published my first two books, and sometimes I almost wish like that I could have done my master's before all this, but I think that things happen as they're meant to happen as well. But to have more knowledge as you're beginning this journey as a writer is always going to empower you. So just take your time, believe in your work, and trust that all that time that you are putting in it, it will come to fruition. But you just have to want it badly enough, and you have to want to work on that project until it gets a yes, in order to meet that. Because you may run into a whole bunch of rejections first, but those rejections do not mean that book should not be published. It just means that you need to keep revising it, or you need to keep working on it until it's at the place it's supposed to be.
Thank you. Well, I'm not a fiction writer, so I'm not sure if I have more to add, but I think a great story to me as a reader is a story that has lots of nuances in it, that has great bit of depth and several layers, and a kind of complexity that's intriguing but not, I mean, meaningless at the same time. Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of advice I can give to young writers. And as a publisher who has a focus on politics, history, and gender, I would love to see young writers, more and more young writers pursuing political fiction.
Thank you so much for that advice. So my next question is, in a post-colonial world, why is it important to use the power of storytelling to reclaim narratives and identity? And I know we touched on that, but if you could go into more depth in your answer this time, that'd be great.
I can start. I think the first thing that came to mind when you just asked that question was, I'm not sure whether we're living in a post-colonial world. I think that maybe colonialism has just evolved. I think about, you know, what suppression looks like in India today. I think about the case of Disha Ravi, who was arrested just a few months ago for sharing a toolkit, or like contributing to an organizing toolkit. And the Indian government just had a whole meltdown over it and arrested her. And then a judge said that this is ridiculous, and she was freed. But we're living in a day and age where conformity is almost demanded by these nation states. And when you do not conform in any minor way, you are otherized, and you are demonized for it. I think about the fact that in Modi's India, conformity under right-wing extremist Hinduism is like an expectation now. If you can't fit everybody under the box of Hindutva, then they're not proper Indians, or they're not true citizens, or whatever the RSS wants people to believe. But I think that kind of those attitudes emerge from the white colonialism and British colonialism that we saw over the past centuries. They're an extension of that, and they're almost like another arm of that kind of colonialism, even though we want to, or those those parties would make you believe that they have freed you from those oppressions. They've just kind of adopted the oppressions and learned to make them work for themselves. So I think that we're still moving towards a world that is eradicating these barriers. And it's through storytelling, it's through art, it's through poetry, it's through activism, through creative activism, that we're able to kind of breathe and survive under these systems. I think that, you know, with the example of the farmer protests in Delhi, you've seen so much artwork come out of that movement. Artwork online on social media that then gets printed out and turned into posters and signs at protests that people are using to propel their movement forward. You also see music from Punjabi artists who typically would not write about political stuff. I think that these forms of art, whether it's a story, whether it's a novel, whether it's visual art, whether it's music, those are the things that keep people alive when everything is trying to just crush you. Those are the things that help us maintain our sense of humanity when the world is trying to erase our humanity. And I think that because of that, art is not a luxury, rather it's a necessity. If we didn't have these things, I don't think that we would be able to keep our souls in this very violent world that we live in.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with Jasmine. The kind of situation that prevails in India and Pakistan and many other parts of the world demands all of the writers and especially young writers to come up with more and more stories that, you know, transcends the contours of traditional storytelling and also touches upon the realms of politics, the realms of society and other central issues facing today's India and Pakistan. And as Jasmine said, I mean, the importance of this kind of storytelling is exactly the same as the importance used to be in the colonial period, because not much has changed over the decade. So there, I mean, in the context of Pakistan, there needs to be lots of stories about enforced disappearances. There needs to be lots of stories about the economic marginalization that the majority faces in the country. There needs to be lots and lots and more stories about women facing patriarchal. I mean, I would rather say capitalistic patriarchy that's at play. So these are the stories that need to come out, and it's only through these stories, through the power of the printed word, through activism, through engagement with grassroots politics, that we can see a transformation in the world taking place. And that's the only way we can take back some of the spaces taken by us by the repressive forces in both India and Pakistan.
Yeah, I think to bounce off what Bilal and Jasmine said, I think what Bilal said is the post-colonial state is still a colonial state. You know, we are still in that state, looking at what is happening in the world, in South Asia. You know, we've had this huge colonial past, and because of that, you know, besides all the other evils, I think unfortunately a lot of cultural aspects and stories. I think a lot of cultural aspects and stories, they have been lost to time, you know. I think we as writers and publishers, we have that power of storytelling. I think there's a small onus of responsibility that we as authors and publishers like us who have, that we are at an advantage of being a part of other culture. And now we have the opportunity to bridge that gap, you know. I think we have the opportunity to use storytelling mainly and bring back stories that are both universal and, as you said, that just transcend boundaries, you know, across time, place, and cultures. You know, I think using art as a medium to speak up, I think that is the only way I think we're going to be able to speak our minds, you know, in this time, in this era. So yeah.
Thank you so much for all your answers and advice and insight. I really appreciate all that you do. So to wrap up, I have one last question for all of you. Who are your inspirations and favorite writers? And any recommendations for South Asian writers that you think everyone who's listening to this panel should be reading?
I can start. I adore Harsha Walia. Harsha Walia is an activist based in BC who has dedicated her life to organizing. And she just had a new book come out, a nonfiction book called Border and Rule. And all of her books deal with anti-imperialism, neocolonialism, and the ways in which we traverse these capitalist Eurocentric worlds. So I always recommend her work if you are looking for an awesome nonfiction title to read from a South Asian woman.
Sorry, go ahead. Okay. I recently, a couple of months back, I read The Night Diary by Veda Hiranandani. And although it's a middle grade novel, it's a YA novel, I think I would recommend all adults read it. It's a historical fiction. It's set in 1947 during the times of partition. And it is a compilation of diary entries from a 12-year-old girl to her mother who has died during childbirth. And it's about her multicultural identity. Her father is a Hindu, her mother was a Muslim, and everything was fine until partition happened. And it's from her point of view, like how she sees this violence as senseless violence and why suddenly there are boundaries. And I think it's an intensely heart-wrenching novel. It's a story that depicts the struggle of identity and displacement. And I think that issue still exists, you know, even in contemporary times. And I love this book with all my heart. So if you get a chance, I think you must read it.
Well, my interests both as an editor, publisher, fall within the realm of nonfiction. So I may only have names like David Harvey, David Graeber. In Pakistan, there is Dr. Asim Sajjad, Dr. Ali Raza. There are many other names. In India, we have Romila Thapar. All these non-fiction, particularly academic writers who are interdisciplinary. Many of their work is interdisciplinary in nature, but majorly political economy and history is what interests me as a reader. So I may not have many names of fiction writers besides Arundhati Roy in India, Muhammad Hanif in Pakistan. And yeah, there are many more. Young writers are doing great. So yeah, lots of encouragement to those.
Thank you so much for those recommendations. Everyone who is listening, just a reminder that Sakit's put in a Google form that allows you to receive an e-copy of When You Ask Me Where I'm Going by Jasmin Kaur. So just fill out the form in the chat and you will be receiving an amazing ebook. So we are wrapping up this panel. I was just wondering if all the panelists could go around and give us some closing remarks, any advice, or just closing statements that you think we should be taking away.
I am so happy to be in this space. I'm 28 years old. I am doing my MFA now, but for a long time I was out of school. And these were the things that I missed while I was out of school, these kinds of radical organizing spaces. And to be in a space filled with radical South Asians from like totally different backgrounds and diverse places in the world is so beautiful to me. So I'm thrilled to be a part of such a powerful and beautiful event.
Same here. I learned so much about about publishing in Pakistan, how challenging it is, and I know Jasmin's work. I have read her work, and so I am just happy to be here with you guys, and I'm really excited for SAYI. I'm really happy for this organization. They have been doing amazing work, and it's really great to see so much passion in the youth. About so much passion and concern and care into today's youth. And I just wish that, more of these organizations happen and more of these events happen, and more people write, more people speak up, and there are more such platforms available to writers and publishers, So this is great. I'm extremely thankful to SAYI and the team for putting these together.
Yeah, I mean, likewise. Thank you to everyone, to Nandini, to Jasmine, to Sita. It's been, I think, a wonderful conversation. And thank you all the participants who were listening to us patiently all this time. I would just like to say, as my work depicts over the years, that more and more young people need to be part of politics. They need to sort of engage with grassroots movements wherever you are. If you are in India, support the farmers. Even if you are not in India, support the farmers from wherever you are. If you are in Pakistan, support all the grassroots leftist movements in Pakistan. If you're not in Pakistan, support them financially. Haqooq-e-Khalq movement have also recently set up an account, and we would like to see more and more friends and comrades to sort of pay attention to the work that we do, the connections that we make, the engagements that we undertake with the working class all over Pakistan. And at the same time, I would encourage young writers to write more, to read more, detach yourself from the fast-paced routine in the developed world, but also increasingly in the developing world. Take some time to sort of read and reflect, and it would be wonderful to see more and more young writers taking up the responsibility of propagating important, critical, progressive discourses in the times to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists for sharing your experiences and wisdom with us today. I'm so grateful for your time and insight. We are now at 4:01 p.m. EST, so this concludes our South Asian Writers panel. Thank you again to our panelists.